The Great Hall of the Galactic Conclave was a place that was built to impress. Its ceiling stretched so high that the top was lost in shadow. Its walls were made of a stone that had been carried from 17 different worlds, one slab from each member species, pressed together into something that was supposed to represent unity. Tall windows let in the light of a pale blue star. The floor was so polished that every delegate could see their own reflection when they looked down. It was a beautiful place. It was also a place full of liars. The session that evening was quiet. Most of the delegates had already left for the night. Only a small group remained in the lower archive chamber, deep beneath the main hall, where the oldest records were kept. The air down there was cold and dry, and the lights were dim. It was the kind of place where things were put so that no one would look for them. Sivith was not supposed to be there. She was a junior archivist, Keth by species, with pale green scales and eyes the color of amber. She had been assigned to catalog a collection of old trade agreements from the early years of the conclave. It was boring work. It was the kind of work given to people who were new and had not yet proven themselves. She had been at it for 3 weeks without finding anything interesting. But that evening, while sorting through a folder of mislabeled files, she found something that did not belong. It was a communication log. Very old, but not old enough to be in that section of the archive. The file had no proper label. Someone had buried it inside a folder titled Expired Tariff Reviews, Sector 9, Closed. No one would ever look there. No one was supposed to. Sivith opened it out of habit more than curiosity. She read the first line. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still for a long time. The file was a transmission record. It had been received 73 years ago by a conclave relay station near the edge of what was called the Kareth Vale. The Kareth Vale was a region of space that the conclave had officially declared off-limits. The official reason was that the area was unstable, full of spatial anomalies, dead stars, and dangerous radiation. Ships that went in did not come out. It was a graveyard, they said. The transmission in the file was not from a dead ship. It was from the UESV Thermopylae. That was a human vessel. The lead ship of what had once been called the Vanguard Armada, humanity's greatest fleet, 214 warships strong, carrying over 400,000 men and women into deep space on a mission of exploration 73 years ago. The conclave's official history said the Vanguard Armada had been lost. Terrible accident. A spatial anomaly had swallowed them whole. The human species had been told this. They had held memorial services. They had built a wall on Earth with 400,000 names carved into it. Children grew up learning about the great tragedy of the lost fleet. The transmission in the file told a very different story. It was short. The signal had been weak, but the words were clear enough to read. The crew of the Thermopylae had been alive. They had been trying to reach someone. They had sent message after message, and every message had gone unanswered. The file showed why. There were internal conclave orders attached to the transmission log. Orders signed by 3 council speakers. Orders directing conclave relay stations to block all incoming signals from beyond the Kareth Vale. Orders to destroy the navigation relay beacons that the Vanguard fleet had been using to find its way home. The fleet had not been lost. The fleet had been abandoned. On purpose. By the people who were supposed to protect every species in the galaxy. Sivith read the reason in a separate document attached to the same buried file. It was written in the formal language of the conclave, which was always careful and polite even when it was describing something monstrous. The Vanguard Armada had discovered something beyond the Kareth Vale. A network of ancient structures left behind by a civilization so old that no living species had a name for them. The conclave called them the precursors. The structures were called forges. They were massive, complex, and still functional. They could build things, ships, weapons, technology, on a scale that nothing alive in the galaxy could match. The Council had not wanted humanity to have them. The document was honest about the reason, in its cold and careful way. Humanity had only been a member of the conclave for a short time. But in that short time, they had already shown qualities that made the older species nervous. They were fast learners. They were stubborn beyond reason. They did not give up when they were supposed to. They found solutions to problems that had stumped older and larger civilizations for centuries. They were creative in ways that were hard to predict. And they felt things, anger, loyalty, grief, with an intensity that other species found uncomfortable. A species like that, the document argued, should not have access to unlimited production of advanced warships. The risk to conclave stability was too great. So the Council had made a choice. A quiet choice made by a small group in a closed room. They had cut the Vanguard Armada off. They had silenced the signals. They had destroyed the beacons. They had left 400,000 human beings on the other side of the galaxy with no way to find their way home. And then they had gone back to their beautiful hall and told the human ambassador that there had been a terrible accident. Sivith sat in the cold archive room for a long time after she finished reading. She thought about what she should do. She was young. She was new. The file was 73 years old. The people who had signed those orders were long dead. She could close the folder. She could put it back where she had found it. She could go back to cataloging trade agreements and pretend she had never seen it. She almost did that. But then she scrolled to the bottom of the file. There was one more entry. It was not 73 years old. The timestamp on it was 6 days ago. It was another transmission from the Thermopylae. The signal was strong this time, very strong. It had been received by a conclave monitoring station near the outer edge of the Kareth Vale, and the station had flagged it and automatically routed it into the archive system before any human operator had seen it. The system had buried it in the same old folder out of automated habit, matching it to the previous transmission records. The message was 7 words long. Asterisk, we are still here, and we remember. Asterisk. Sivith read those 7 words 3 times. Then she did something that would change her life forever. She copied the file onto a personal data chip, slipped it into the inner pocket of her robe, stood up, and walked out of the archive room. She walked down the corridor. She walked past the guard station. She smiled at the guard on duty, who waved her through without looking up from his desk. She walked out into the cool night air of the conclave station and kept walking. She did not know exactly what she was going to do with what she had found. She only knew that it needed to be found by the right people. And the right people, she had decided, were not in the Great Hall above. The human ambassador's office was located on the 42nd floor of the diplomatic residential tower. Director Mara Osei had lived in that office for 11 years. She was a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had learned not to show what it was thinking. She had spent her career navigating the complicated social waters of the conclave, always aware that humanity was considered the new species, the young species, the one that had to be careful about how much space it took up. She was awake when Sivith knocked on her door. It was past midnight. Mara had not been sleeping. She had been going over trade statistics and trying to ignore the feeling she had carried for the past 2 days. A feeling that something was wrong in the conclave, that there was a tension in the corridors she could not identify, that the other delegates were being polite to her in a way that meant they were hiding something. She opened the door and looked at the young Keth archivist standing in the hallway. She had never met Sivith before. She looked at the expression on the young woman's face, the pale scales, the amber eyes, the careful stillness of someone who was frightened but had decided to be brave, and she stepped back to let her in. Sivith sat down across from Mara's desk and placed the data chip on the table between them. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Mara plugged the chip into her reader and began to go through the file. She read slowly and carefully, which was how she always read important things. She read the transmission logs. She read the orders. She read the reason. She read the quiet, polite language in which the Council had explained why 400,000 human beings should be abandoned in the dark and forgotten. When she finished, she set the reader down on the desk. She looked at the wall for a moment. Then she looked back at Sivith. "How long ago did you find this?" she asked. 2 hours, Sivith said. "Have you told anyone else?" "No." "Does anyone know you're here?" "No." Mara nodded slowly. She picked up the reader again and looked at the last entry. 7 words. Strong signal. 6 days old. "They're coming back," she said. It was not a question. Sivith nodded. Mara Osei sat back in her chair. Outside the window behind her, The pale blue star that lit the conclave station moved slowly across the sky. The great hall below was dark. The 17 slabs of stone from 17 worlds stood silent in the shadows, pressed together in their shape that was supposed to mean something about peace. She looked at the 7 words on the screen. Asterisk, we are still here. And we remember. Asterisk. Good, Mara said quietly to no one in particular. She got up, walked to her window, and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond a veil of dead light and broken space, 214 ships were moving. 400,000 people, or the children and grandchildren of 400,000 people, were coming home. The conclave had spent 73 years building a beautiful lie. She did not know yet what was going to happen when the truth arrived. But she knew one thing with complete certainty. She was not going to stand in its way. The emergency session of the Conclave Council began at 3 in the morning, and no one was supposed to know about it. There were no official records made. No transcripts were kept. The 17 council speakers arrived through private access corridors, some still dressed for sleep, and gathered in a small room beneath the grand hall that had no windows and only one door. The room was used for exactly this kind of meeting, the kind that could not be explained to the public, the kind that only happened when something had gone wrong in a way that could not be made to sound ordinary. Archlegate Vorn called the meeting to order. He was old, even by the standards of his species, the Dravith, who were known for living a very long time. His skin was the color of dry stone. His eyes were large and pale, and they moved slowly, like something that had learned long ago that the world moved at a pace it could afford to wait for. He had been on the council for 60 years. He had been one of the 3 speakers who had signed the original orders 73 years ago. He was the only one of the 3 still alive. He did not look frightened. He looked tired and careful and very still. The signal is confirmed, said the conclave's head of deep-range monitoring, a small Veth named Aurelius, who had been pulled from his bed and was now standing at the front of the room with a data display floating in the air beside him. We received it 5 days ago. It was automatically routed and flagged by the border station at Relay Post 7 Alpha. The transmission is strong, much stronger than anything the original fleet was capable of producing. How much stronger? Asked Speaker Kelleth, a broad-shouldered Marn whose gray fur was flat against his skull, which meant he was afraid. Approximately 40 times, Aurelius said. We believe they have rebuilt and enhanced their communication systems using precursor technology. The room was quiet for a moment. What else do the sensor readings tell us? Vorn asked. Aurelius changed the display. A map appeared showing the edge of the Kareth Vale, a region that looked on a star map like a long dark smear at the far edge of the known galaxy. Around the edge of the veil, a cluster of small dots was marked in red. Mass displacement readings, Aurelius said. Gravitational signatures consistent with large vessels using fusion drives. We counted at least 180 distinct signatures before the readings were lost in background interference. More may be present. The formation is tight and disciplined. Very disciplined. He paused. More disciplined than any fleet we have on record. How long until they reach inner conclave space? Asked Speaker Dreen, a tall, thin Elarath whose long fingers were pressed together in a way that suggested she was trying to stay calm. At current speed estimates, 14 days. Perhaps 12 if they push harder. Another silence. Longer this time. We need to prepare a response, Kelleth said. Military options need to be on the table immediately. We cannot allow what? Vorn said. His voice was quiet, but it stopped Kelleth mid-sentence. We cannot allow them to return? They are returning. That is no longer a thing we can prevent. What we can control is what happens when they arrive. We control nothing, said Speaker Dreen softly. If they have precursor technology, we control nothing at all. Vorn looked at her for a long moment. He did not tell her she was wrong. The human ambassador must not be told, he said. Not yet. We need time to understand what we are dealing with before that conversation happens. He looked around the room. No one outside this group speaks of this. No one. We will meet again in 48 hours. By then, I want full military readiness assessments from every member fleet and a complete analysis of what precursor technology may have been integrated into those ships." He stood up slowly, pressing his hands flat on the table. "We built a wall to keep something out 73 years ago. It seems the wall did not hold." He walked out. The others followed, one by one, back through their private corridors, back into the dark and quiet station, each of them carrying the same thought in different ways. The thing they had feared most was coming, and they had made it themselves. Director Mara Osei noticed the change the next morning. She was good at noticing things. It was the skill she valued most in herself. She had learned it over 11 years of working in the conclave, where almost nothing important was ever said directly. You learned to read the way a delegate held their shoulders. You learned to notice when a corridor that was usually busy was suddenly empty. You learned that when people were being especially pleasant to you, it almost always meant they were keeping something from you. The morning after Sivitha's visit, everyone was being especially pleasant to her. 3 separate council aides stopped her in the corridor to exchange small talk. Speaker Kelleth, who normally walked past her without eye contact, stopped to ask about her health. The scheduling office, which usually took 4 days to respond to her requests, sent her a lunch reservation confirmation within 20 minutes of her sending it. She smiled at all of them. She thanked them. She walked back to her office and closed the door. She had spent the rest of the previous night going through the file Sivith had brought her. She had read it 6 times. She had copied it to her own secure system and deleted the original from the chip so that if anyone came looking, Sivith would have nothing on her. Then she had sat in the dark for a long time, thinking. She had made no official report. She had sent no messages. She had simply sat and thought, which was how she made all of her important decisions. Now, watching the conclave's careful, pleasant smiles, she made another one. She would wait. She would watch. She would not give them any sign that she knew what was coming. And when the time came, she would not be where they expected her to be. The border station at the outer edge of the conclave's monitored space was a small installation, 12 crew, mostly automated, designed for long-range sensor sweeps and relay maintenance. Its name was Forward Post 19. The crew called it the end of the road. On the 8th day after the conclave's secret meeting, the crew of Forward Post 19 had a very unusual morning. The long-range sensors, which normally showed nothing but empty space and the occasional rogue comet, began registering contacts. Many contacts. The automated system flagged them immediately and began counting. Chief Sensor Operator Yevna, a young Veth woman on her first deep space posting, watched the count climb on her screen and felt her stomach drop. 20 ships. 50. 100. 140. 214. They came out of the darkness beyond the veil in a long, slow line, and then spread into a formation that was unlike anything Yevna had seen in any tactical reference she had ever studied. It was not the wide, scattered formation that most conclave fleets used. It was tight and geometric, layered in overlapping arcs, every ship positioned to cover every other ship. It was a formation built by people who had spent a very long time thinking about how to fight and how to protect each other. The ships were not what she expected. She had seen old records of the original Vanguard Armada. The ships in those records were recognizably human in design, angular, functional, somewhat plain compared to the elegant curves preferred by older species. What she was looking at now shared the same basic bones, but everything else had changed. The hulls were heavier, layered with materials that her sensor systems could not classify. Strange structures ran along the outer hull of each vessel like the rings of a tree, growing outward in patterns that seemed organic and mathematical at the same time. The largest ships were nearly twice the length of the originals. They moved, all 214 of them, as if they were being controlled by a single mind. At the center of the formation was the biggest ship of all. Her systems managed to pull an identification number from its hull beacon before it switched to a frequency her systems could not decode. UESV Thermopylae. It was the oldest ship in the fleet. The original flagship. 73 years in the dark, and it was still leading. Yevna opened a broadcast channel out of reflex, the standard challenge sent to all unidentified vessels approaching conclave space. She asked them to identify themselves, state their origin point, and submit to a standard approach inspection. The response came immediately. It was on every open frequency at once. Every channel she had. The automated backup channels. The emergency bands. Even the channels that were technically decommissioned but still technically functional. The signal came through all of them at the same time, loud and absolutely clear. A woman's voice. Human. Low and calm, with the kind of calm that was not relaxed. It was the calm of someone who had decided something and was completely at peace with the decision. This is Fleet Admiral Dara Vasquez, commanding officer of the Vanguard Armada, broadcasting to all Conclave stations and vessels. We are returning to Conclave space. We have been beyond the Kareth Veil for 73 years. We are aware of what the Council did to strand us there. We have the evidence. We are broadcasting it now on all frequencies. A pause. Yevna heard her console begin to chime as data packets began flooding in alongside the voice signal. Files, documents, transmission records. She recognized what they were even before her system finished decoding them. The Admiral's voice returned. We are not here to ask for help. We are not here to negotiate. We are not here to request an inquiry or a committee or a formal review. We are here because what was done to us was a crime, and the people who committed it and the system that allowed it need to answer for it. Another pause, shorter this time. We are not asking for justice. We are here to collect it. The broadcast ended. The silence on forward post 19 lasted about 4 seconds. Then every alarm Yevna had started going off at once, and she was reaching for the emergency relay to the inner stations, and the fleet outside her window was already moving. Steady, unhurried, deliberate, deeper into conclave space. On the bridge of the Thermopylae, Fleet Admiral Dara Vasquez lowered the transmitter and turned to face the wide forward viewport. She was 41 years old. She had been born on the Thermopylae in the ship's medical bay during the fleet's 23rd year beyond the Veil. Her parents had both been crew. Her grandfather had been the original fleet's senior navigation officer. She had grown up in corridors and cargo bays and training rooms, surrounded by thousands of people who all carried the same quiet weight, the knowledge of where they had come from, what had been done to them, and what they were going to do about it. She had never seen a sunrise on a planet. She had never felt rain. She had never walked on ground that did not hum with the vibration of a ship's drive. Earth was a word people used with a certain kind of sadness, the way you talk about a place you love but can't quite reach in a dream. She had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. Every hour of training, every tactical drill, every late night spent bent over precursor schematics with engineers who were only a little less confused than she was. Every argument in Fleet Council meetings about how they would do this, how they would come home, and what home would look like after they got there. She pressed her hand flat against the cool surface of the viewport. The stars ahead of her were different from the stars she had grown up watching. There were more lights here. Stations. Ships. The lights of a civilization that had spent 73 years pretending she did not exist. Navigation, she said. Admiral. Set course for the Conclave Central Station. Standard approach speed. She paused. No, not standard. Comfortable. Let them see us coming. Yes, Admiral. She stayed at the viewport for a long time watching the stars. She was not angry exactly. She had been angry for a long time, but anger was like a fire. It burned through its fuel eventually and left something cooler and harder behind. What she felt now was older than anger. It was the feeling of someone who had waited a very long time for a door to open and had used every minute of the waiting to become something the people on the other side of that door were not ready for. The Thermopylae moved forward. Behind it, 213 ships moved with it, silent and perfect and terrible. They were home, and the reckoning was just beginning. The conclave broke apart before the Vanguard Armada even reached the inner systems. It did not break in a loud or obvious way. The Great Hall did not crack. The 17 stone slabs in the floor stayed pressed together. The lights kept burning, the schedules kept running, and the delegates kept showing up in their proper places with their proper expressions. But underneath all of that, the structure of the conclave, the agreements and the alliances and the quiet understandings that held 17 species together, began to fall apart like something that had been wet for a long time and had finally given way. It started within hours of the fleet's broadcast. The documents the Vanguard had transmitted alongside Admiral Vasquez's message had gone out on every open frequency. That meant every monitoring station, every civilian relay, every deep space vessel with a receiver had gotten them. The Conclave's communication team scrambled to suppress the signal, but it was like trying to hold back water with your hands. The data was already out, already being read, already being copied and forwarded and discussed in 1,000 different places by 1,000 different people who were asking the same question. Did the Council really do this? The answer, for anyone who read the documents carefully, was clearly yes. 6 of the 17 Council species issued public statements within the first 24 hours. All 6 condemned the returning fleet. They used words like rogue element and radicalized force and threat to conclave stability. One of them, the Droken speaker, called the Vanguard crew mentally compromised by prolonged exposure to uncharted space. This was said with a straight face and a very serious expression, and almost no one believed it. For other species said nothing publicly, but their diplomatic channels were suddenly very active. Quietly, without official signatures or recorded meetings, representatives from each of those 4 species made contact with the Vanguard fleet. They offered information. They provided internal conclave military deployment data, fleet positions, communication codes. They did this because they had their own reasons for wanting the Council's power structure weakened, and they were wise enough to know which side in this particular conflict was going to be the more dangerous one. The remaining 7 species did something that was, in a way, the most telling response of all. They began pulling their border fleets inward. Not toward the Vanguard. Not away from it either. Just inward into tighter defensive positions, like animals pulling themselves small before a storm. They were waiting to see what happened. They had learned something important from watching the conclave for a very long time, and what they had learned was that the wisest thing you could do in a situation like this was not choose a side too early. Director Mara Osei received her summons to the council chamber on the morning of the second day. She had been expecting it. She had spent the previous night preparing for it. She had read through every document in the file Sivith had brought her again, this time making careful notes. She had also spent several hours reviewing every public statement the Council had made about the Vanguard Armada over the past 73 years. Every tribute speech, every memorial address, every somber declaration about the bravery of the lost crew and the tragedy of their end. She brought her notes with her to the chamber. She did not bring an assistant or an aide. She walked in alone. The 7 speakers who had gathered were seated at the curved table at the front of the chamber. Archlegate Vorn was at the center. He looked at her with those large, pale eyes and said nothing as she took her seat across from them. The others watched her with the careful expressions of people who were deciding how much to admit and in what order. Speaker Kelleth spoke first. He was the one who had called the meeting. He placed a folder on the table in front of Mara and slid it toward her. "We wanted to speak with you directly," he said. "Before you heard about this from other sources. We believe the people returning in those ships have been exposed to materials and energies beyond the Kareth Veil that have damaged them. Their perceptions. Their judgment." He tapped the folder. "Our scientific team has compiled an assessment. Prolonged exposure to the precursor structures and the radiation fields in that region has likely produced psychological changes in the crew, passed down through generations. What they believe happened to them is not necessarily what actually happened. Their grievances, while understandable, are built on." "Stop," Mara said. Kelleth stopped. The other speakers went very still. She opened the folder. She looked at the first page of the document inside it. She turned to the second page. Then the third. Then she closed the folder and set it flat on the table with her hands pressed on top of it. "I've read this," she said. "Not this specific document, but the argument in it. I've read it in the original files that your council buried 73 years ago. The same argument. That humanity is unstable. That humanity is unpredictable. That humanity's emotions are excessive and their ambition is dangerous, and therefore they cannot be trusted with what they found." The chamber was quiet. "I want to be very clear with all of you," Mara said. "I know what the documents in that fleet's broadcast contain. I know what your council did. I have known since 2 nights ago, when an archivist came to my door in the middle of the night because her conscience would not let her sleep. She looked at each of them in turn. That archivist, by the way, is under my protection. If anything happens to her, I will consider it a hostile act against the human delegation. Vorn spoke for the first time. Director Osei. I'm not finished, she said. He closed his mouth. You left 400,000 people in the dark. You cut their way home. You watched them disappear, and then you came out and held ceremonies for them and told their families they died with honor. Her voice was completely steady. She had decided before she walked into the room that she would not raise it, because she did not need to. You built a wall with their names on it. You made speeches. And then you went back to this chamber and sat in your chairs and went on with your business, and that was the end of it. She stood up. I am the human ambassador to this conclave. I have spent 11 years sitting at your tables and following your rules and being careful about how much space I take up because that is what was asked of me. She picked up the fabricated document in the folder. She held it up. Then she let it fall back onto the table. I will not be issuing any statement condemning the Vanguard Armada. I will not be attending any briefings designed to produce one. I will not be standing beside this council when it tries to explain to the galaxy why what it did was somehow necessary or reasonable or for the greater good. She picked up her notes. She pushed her chair back. And I want all of you to understand something. She looked at Vorn last because he was the oldest and the most dangerous and the one whose opinion mattered most. I am not going to stand in that fleet's way. Not one step. Whatever they do next, whatever shape this reckoning takes, I am not going to be on your side of it. She walked to the door. Behind her, no one said anything. She heard Kelitha's chair scrape against the floor, as if he was thinking about standing up, and then the sound stopped and she heard nothing else. She walked out of the chamber. She walked down the corridor. She walked past the guard station and the pale marble walls and the windows that looked out over the station. She went back to her office, sat down at her desk, and for the first time since Sivith had knocked on her door, she allowed herself to feel something other than careful. It was not satisfaction, exactly. It was something heavier than that. The feeling of a door that had been held shut for a very long time finally being opened, and not knowing yet what the air on the other side would feel like. The Vanguard Armada did not race toward the Conclave's heart. It moved at a considered pace, steady, and even the kind of pace that said, we are not afraid of you and we are not in a hurry. The formation did not break. The ships did not scatter. They moved as a single mass through the outer systems, and as they moved, they continued broadcasting. Every few hours, a new set of documents was released. Internal council memos from 50 years ago, discussing the cover story they had constructed. A financial record showing that the maintenance budget for the Kareth Vale relay beacons had been secretly cancelled rather than the beacons themselves failing. A personal letter from one council speaker to another, written 30 years after the event, in which the writer said simply that he sometimes woke in the night thinking about it. The galaxy read all of it. Public response was unlike anything the Conclave's communication teams had modeled for. They had expected outrage, they had prepared for outrage. What they had not prepared for was the particular quality of the feeling that spread across inhabited space in those days. It was not just anger. It was the feeling of something believed for a long time turning out to be false. 73 years of a story, the tragedy of the lost fleet, the brave crew gone into the dark, turned inside out and shown to be a murder dressed up as a memorial. Statues of conclave speakers were removed in 3 systems. Protests happened outside human embassies, not against humanity. People bringing flowers, bringing lights, standing quietly with signs that said things like, "We did not know." A Marn elder on one of the frontier worlds gave a speech that was widely shared in which he said, in his species' direct way, "We were lied to and we should be ashamed of what was done in our name." The Conclave's public response teams tried to control the narrative. They released their fabricated assessment document, the one claiming the crew had been psychologically altered. It was picked apart by independent researchers within hours. Scientists pointed out that the precursor materials cited as causing mental damage were ones the Conclave had never actually studied. Journalists found that the lead researcher listed on the document had only been assigned to the project 4 days ago. The document fell apart before it could do any good, and its failure made things worse, because now it was proof that the Council was still lying, still trying to manage the story, still choosing spin over truth. And through all of it, the Vanguard Armada kept moving. Steady, unhurried. Vasquez spent most of those days on the bridge of the Thermopylae, reviewing tactical data and meeting with her fleet council. She was asked more than once whether she intended to fire on civilian targets. The question bothered her, not because it was unfair, but because she understood why it was being asked. She answered it the same way every time. We are not here to punish the galaxy for what the Council did. We are here to hold the Council responsible. Those are different things. I need every person in every species to understand the difference. She meant it. She had spent years thinking about what this homecoming would look like. She had made choices about it, hard choices, choices that some in her own fleet had argued against. But she had held firm on all of them, because she understood something that the Council did not seem to understand about her people. Humanity had learned, in 73 years in the dark, exactly what they were capable of. They had learned how far they could push and what happened when they did. They had built things and broken things and lost people and started over, and they had come out the other side knowing themselves in a way that very few civilizations ever had the chance to. They had come home to make a point, not to become the thing they were fighting. Not yet, anyway. But they were not above letting the Council wonder about that. The inner systems were now 4 days away. The Conclave Defense Fleet was assembling at Orith Station, the largest military installation in the known galaxy. Reports were coming in of more ships being pulled from patrol routes, more reserves being called up, more firepower being gathered in one place than had existed in a single location in living memory. Vasquez looked at the tactical map on her display for a long time. Then she looked up at her first officer, a quiet, steady man named Ruin, whose grandmother had been the Thermopylae's original chief engineer. They're gathering everything at Orith, she said. Yes, he said. Good, she said. That means it'll all be in one place. She turned back to the map. She did not look worried. That was the thing about Vasquez that the Conclave's analysts had missed in all their modeling. They had calculated the Vanguard's military capacity. They had assessed the firepower. They had studied the formation patterns and the drive signatures and the unknown hull materials. They had been very thorough. What they had not modeled was 73 years of someone waiting, preparing, and wanting. That kind of thing did not fit neatly into a tactical assessment. But it was the most important factor of all. The Battle of Orith Station began at dawn, by the station's internal clock. Orith was the largest military installation the Conclave had ever built. It had been constructed over 40 years, expanded 3 times, and was now a structure so large it had its own gravitational field. It sat at a major junction of transit corridors in the inner systems, which made it both the most strategically important point in Conclave space and the natural place to make a stand. Around it, the assembled Conclave defense fleet floated in a formation that stretched across 200,000 kilometers. More than 1,000 warships, the largest gathered force in living memory. Every tactical analyst who had run the numbers agreed. The Vanguard Armada, with 214 ships, could not win this fight. The math was too clear. Numbers, firepower, position, every advantage belonged to the Conclave. The most optimistic estimates given to Vasquez's fleet predicted that they could damage perhaps a third of the Conclave force before being overwhelmed. Those estimates were made by people who did not know what the Vanguard was actually carrying. In the 73 years that the fleet had spent beyond the Kareth Vale, the crew had done what humans always did when put in an impossible situation with no way out. They had gotten to work. The precursor forges they had discovered were ancient beyond any easy description. The civilization that had built them was gone so long ago that no trace of it remained anywhere in the galaxy except these structures. These massive, silent, impossible machines that still functioned after an amount of time that no one could calculate. The fleet's first engineers had spent years just trying to understand what they were looking at. The second generation had begun to figure out how to interact with the systems. The third generation had started using them. What they produced over decades of slow and careful learning was not magic. It was technology, built on principles that the Conclave science had never reached because the Conclave had never had reason to push that far. principles of material science and energy management that were so far ahead of what the known galaxy used that the gap between them was not a step or two but the length of an entire age of development. The most important thing they had built was the armor. It was not metal. It was not any single material. It was a composite that the Vanguard's engineers had spent 30 years developing, layer by layer, guided by precursor design principles they were only partially able to understand. The outer layers were harder than anything the Conclave used. But the inner layers were different. They were designed to take the energy from an impact and distribute it, spread it across the hull in a fraction of a second, convert it into a form the ship systems could actually use. A hit from a Conclave cannon did not damage a Vanguard ship the way it was supposed to. It stung it, and then the ship used the energy from that sting to power its own systems. The Conclave's weapons, in a very literal sense, fed them. The second thing was the drives. Fold pulse technology was something the Conclave's physicists had theorized for centuries and dismissed as impractical. The energy requirements were too high, the precision required was too great, the margin for error was too small. You could not make a ship disappear from one point in space and reappear at another point in space at combat distances. It simply was not possible within acceptable engineering constraints. The Vanguard had decided that acceptable engineering constraints were someone else's problem. The fold pulse drives on each Vanguard ship could execute a microjump of up to 20 kilometers in any direction in less than a second. In practice, this meant that in a fight, a Vanguard ship could blink out of existence and reappear somewhere else before a weapon locked onto it. It meant that when a Conclave vessel thought it had a clear shot, the target was somewhere else. It meant that the entire concept of maintaining a firing solution, the foundational skill of space combat, was almost useless against them. The third thing was the weapons. The resonance cannons were the Vanguard's answer to a problem they had thought about for a long time. When they came home, they did not want to destroy the Conclave fleet. They did not want bodies. They did not want a slaughter that the galaxy could point to and use to call them monsters. They wanted to win decisively, and they wanted the people on the other side to survive long enough to understand what had happened. The resonance cannon worked by sending a focused wave of energy through a ship's hull, not destroying the hull itself, but passing through it like a sound passing through a wall. The wave disrupted the electronic systems inside, drive cores, weapons systems, life support on a low setting, navigation, shields, everything that made a warship without touching a single living body inside it. A ship hit by a resonance cannon became a very large, very expensive, completely helpless piece of metal drifting in space. The crew inside was fine, scared but fine. The fourth thing was Sable. The Conclave had artificial intelligence systems. Most civilizations did. But they were careful systems, controlled systems, kept in tight boxes with defined tasks and hard limits. The Conclave had a long and complicated history with AI that had made it collectively cautious. The systems they built were powerful in specific narrow ways, but they did not think. They did not adapt. They did not learn from a fight while the fight was happening. Sable was different. It had grown organically over 73 years from something that started as a navigation assistant and had expanded, generation by generation, as the fleet's engineers fed it more data, more problems, and more freedom to find solutions. It was not a single intelligence. It was a network, spread across all 214 ships, connected by a communication system so fast and so tightly encrypted that it was effectively instantaneous. Sable did not just coordinate the fleet. It thought for the fleet. It processed every sensor reading from every ship simultaneously and used all of it to make decisions about positioning, timing, and targeting that no group of human tacticians could have matched. The Conclave was sending 1,000 warships against 214. What it did not know was that it was also sending those 1,000 warships against a single tactical mind of breathtaking capability, operating at a speed no biological commander could approach. The battle lasted 11 hours. In the first hour, the Conclave fleet opened fire at maximum range, expecting to bleed the Vanguard before it could close the distance. What happened instead was that the Vanguard ships blinked. They were there, and then they were not, and then they were somewhere else, and the shots hit empty space. When the Vanguard ships reappeared, they were inside the Conclave formation, in the spaces between ships where the angles were worst and the larger fleet's own vessels were in each other's firing lines. In the second hour, the conclave commanders recognized what was happening and tried to adjust. They broke their formation into smaller, faster groups. The Vanguard's Sable network saw this happen and had already redistributed the fleet's positioning before the conclave's orders had finished being sent. Every adaptation the conclave tried, Sable had already anticipated. In the third hour, the resonance cannons opened up. The effect on the conclave ships was terrifying in the most precise sense, not because of destruction but because of what it looked like. A ship struck by a resonance cannon did not explode. Its lights went out. Its engines stopped. It became silent. It drifted. Ship after ship going dark across the formation like lights being switched off one by one. The crew inside were alive and unhurt, but their ships were dead. The conclave's commanders kept fighting. They had courage, most of them, they were not cowards. But courage is not enough when you are fighting an enemy whose shots you cannot dodge, whose ships you cannot hit, and whose weapons remove your ability to fight without killing you. When you cannot fire back and you cannot run and you cannot die bravely, at some point you stop and ask yourself what you are actually accomplishing. By the fifth hour, the first conclave ships began broadcasting surrender signals. By the eighth hour, more than half the fleet had gone dark. Not destroyed, just taken off the board, sitting silently in space while their crews waited in the dark and hoped that whoever was on the other side of this fight meant what they said about not hurting people. In the 11th hour, the last of the conclave's active ships powered down its weapons and went still. The battle was over. The Vanguard Armada had not lost a single ship. Vasquez stood at the viewport of the Thermopylae and looked at what the battle had produced. Hundreds of dark ships, floating in loose clusters across a field of space that was lit only by the distant blue glow of Orith Station's docking lights. No fire, no debris field, no bodies venting into space. She had spent years deciding that this was how she would do it. She had argued about it with her officers, with her fleet council, with herself in the late hours when sleep would not come. Some of them had wanted a harder approach. Some of them had said that the galaxy would not listen to restraint, that the only language the council truly understood was loss. She had understood their argument. She had not agreed with it. She was not doing this to teach the conclave a lesson about power. She was doing it to show the rest of the galaxy something about humanity, something that the council's buried documents had called a liability, that deep, stubborn, inconvenient capacity to feel things, to care about things, to hold on to principles even when it would be easier and more effective to let them go. Her first officer Ruin came to stand beside her at the viewport. Sable reports no active hostile signatures in sensor range, he said. Orith Station has opened a communication channel. They are requesting terms. Vasquez nodded. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark ships. How many casualties? She asked, though she had already seen the medical report. Their side, minor injuries on some ships from the system shutdowns. No deaths confirmed. Our side. He paused. 3 injuries. All minor. She nodded again. Ruin, she said. How long did your grandmother say it took her to first understand how the Forge's material system worked? He thought about it. She said about 8 years before she had the fundamental principles. Another 3 before she could reproduce anything. Vasquez looked out at the dark fleet. 11 years, she said. And she was one person. Imagine what she could have done with the whole galaxy science community working alongside her. She turned away from the viewport. That's what they were so afraid of. That's what all of this was about. Not a fleet, not warships, not weapons, just the idea of what humans working with other people could become. She walked toward the command chair. Open the channel to Orith, she said. Tell them we will speak with whatever representative the council chooses to send. And tell them, she sat down, to bring the people who still have the authority to make decisions. We're done talking to messengers. Ruin moved to relay the message. Then he stopped and looked back at her. Admiral, he said, we won. She looked at him. Her expression was not what he expected. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction. It was something older and quieter, the look of someone crossing the last mile of a very long road and thinking about all the miles behind it. "We cleared the path," she said. "The hard part is next." She turned to face the forward viewport. Orith Station's lights glittered ahead of them, soft and blue against the dark. Beyond it, the inner systems waited billions of lives across dozens of worlds, watching and reading and trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant for them. And behind the Thermopylae, 213 ships held their position, patient and still, waiting for whatever came next. The galaxy had spent 73 years forgetting about humanity's lost fleet. It was going to spend a very long time remembering its return. The negotiations did not happen in the Grand Hall. Vasquez had refused that, politely but absolutely. She did not want the curved ceilings and the 17 stone slabs and the tall windows that let in the light of the blue star. She did not want to sit in a place that the Council had built and shaped and controlled for centuries and call it neutral ground. She had requested, instead, a room on the neutral trade station at Kareth Approach, a civilian facility, small and practical, used mostly by cargo operators and transit workers. Plain walls, functional lighting, a table that was nothing special. The Council speakers who arrived looked deeply uncomfortable. This was, Vasquez thought, appropriate. There were 5 of them. Archlegate Vorn was among them, the oldest, the most careful. Beside him sat Speaker Dreen of the Elarath, and Speaker Maleth of the Veth, and 2 others whose names Vasquez had memorized but whose faces she was looking at for the first time. Across from them, on her side of the table, was Director Mara Osei, who had traveled from the Conclave Station and arrived looking as if she had not slept in 4 days, which she had not, but who carried herself with the kind of composure that made tiredness invisible. Beside Mara sat Vasquez's own diplomatic advisor, a fleet-born woman named Counselor Tam, who had spent 10 years preparing for exactly this kind of room. Vasquez sat at the head of the table. She wore her fleet uniform, the same gray and dark design that the original Vanguard crew had worn 73 years ago, updated and adjusted over decades but still recognizably the same, as if the fleet had been careful to keep that thread unbroken. She set her hands flat on the table and looked at the 5 speakers across from her. "I want to begin by making something clear," she said. "This conversation is being recorded and will be published in its entirety within 24 hours of its conclusion. There will be no private understanding, no confidential clause, no side agreement made outside this room. Everything said here will be available for every person in every species to read. If anyone has a problem with that, they should leave now." No one left. "Good," she said. She placed a single document in the center of the table and slid it forward. It was short, a single page with 3 numbered points. "These are my conditions. I will explain each one." The first condition was full disclosure. Every document, every order, every communication, every record that touched on the Conclave's decision to abandon the Vanguard Armada 73 years ago. All of it without redaction, without selection, without any filtering by a Council communication team, to be released simultaneously to every inhabited world. Not managed, not contextualized. Just released, raw and complete, and let the galaxy read it for themselves. Speaker Maleth objected immediately. He said that some of the documents contained information about other operations, about sources, about processes that could not be made public without harming current conclave functions and the safety of ongoing diplomatic work. Vasquez looked at him steadily. "Then you should have thought about that before you put those things in the same files as your orders to strand my people." The objection was withdrawn. The second condition was structural. The Conclave's closed Security Council, the body of senior speakers who had operated without oversight, without record, without accountability, for over a century, would be dissolved. In its place, a new body would be formed with representatives from all 17 species plus, now the Vanguard state. Every session of this body would be recorded. Every decision would require a documented majority vote. No single species, no single speaker, no small group of people meeting in a room with no windows would ever again have the authority to make the kind of decision that had been made 73 years ago. Speaker Dreen asked how this new body would be structured. Vasquez said that was a conversation for a later table, one that would include many more voices than were present in this room. She said she had suggestions but no demand for a specific format, because this body was meant to serve the whole galaxy, not the preferences of one fleet. She said she was, in fact, willing to not have a human chair the body at all, if the other species preferred it that way. This answer surprised the speakers. She could see it in their faces, that small shift of expectation rearranging itself. They had prepared for this meeting the way you prepare to argue against something being taken from you. They had not prepared for the possibility that what they were being asked to do was something that might be reasonable. The third condition was recognition. The Vanguard State, that was the name the fleet had formally adopted for the nation they had become in the dark beyond the Kareth Veil, was to be acknowledged as a full, sovereign, peer power within the known galaxy. Not a conclave member, not at first, though that could come later if both sides chose it. But recognized, named, given standing, given the right to sit at tables, to sign agreements, to make choices about their own territory and their own people without requiring conclave permission. Their territory was the precursor Forge system, the region beyond the Kareth Veil that the Council had tried to keep humanity away from 73 years ago. It was, the Vanguard's lawyers had noted with some satisfaction, territory that the Conclave had officially declared a no-go zone, which meant the Conclave had never formally claimed it, which meant there was no legal dispute about ownership. It was simply theirs. Had been theirs from the moment the Vanguard crew had landed and started working and built a life. Vorn, who had been quiet through most of the session, finally spoke. He did not challenge any of the three conditions. He looked at them with his large, pale eyes and he did not argue or object. He simply looked at Vasquez and asked her, in a quiet and direct voice, "Why? You had the power to take more than this. After Orith, you had more military capacity than any force in the galaxy. You could have demanded anything. Territory, reparations, political control. The galaxy would have had to accept it." He paused. "Why are you asking for this and not for more?" The room was quiet. Vasquez looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the Thermopolis corridors, where she had grown up. She thought about her grandfather, who had served on this ship before she was born and who had died on it before she was old enough to understand loss. She thought about all the people in her fleet who had been born in the dark, who had grown up knowing only the hum of ship drives and the cold light of stars through viewports, who had spent their whole lives preparing for a moment they were not sure they would live to see. She thought about what they had built in those 73 years. Not just ships, not just weapons, something harder to name and more important. "Because my people spent 73 years in the dark," she said. "And what we learned in there, the hard way, the only way things get really learned, is exactly who we are and what we're capable of." She let the silence sit for a moment. "I am not going to spend all of that becoming you." Vorn looked at her for a long time. His expression did not change. But something behind his eyes did. Some very old, very careful thing that had been holding a particular shape for decades quietly releasing itself. He picked up the document. He read it again, though she was fairly sure he had already memorized it. Then he signed it. The other four speakers followed, one by one. The disclosure went out the next morning. All of it. Everything. The orders. The signatures. The meeting notes. The financial records. The cover stories. The communication logs with the Thermopolis unanswered signals. 73 years of buried truth, released simultaneously to every communication relay in the known galaxy. The response was unlike anything anyone had been prepared for. Some worlds erupted in anger. Protests outside conclave offices, demands for investigation, calls for specific speakers to resign. 3 of the 17 species demanded formal apology proceedings against the surviving members of the original council decision chain. The human diaspora, humans living on other worlds, working in other species systems, scattered across the galaxy in the way humans always ended up scattered, gathered in public places and were mostly quiet, which was somehow louder than anger. Some worlds were ashamed, quietly, genuinely ashamed. Ordinary people who had grown up believing the story of the lost fleet, who had lit memorial candles and taught their children about the tragedy, who now had to absorb the knowledge that they had been mourning a murder staged as an accident. They did not know what to do with that yet. It would take time. Some worlds were something else entirely. There were places, particularly among the species that had quietly passed intelligence to the Vanguard during those early days, where the reaction was something closer to relief. as if a weight had been sitting on the conversation for 73 years and had finally been put down. The memorial wall on Earth was in a park in the oldest part of the city of Geneva. It was a long curve of dark stone, taller than a person, with 400,000 names carved into it. Each name had a rank and a posting and a date, the date the fleet had left Earth. There was no death date. The memorial committee had decided 73 years ago that putting a date of loss was too imprecise, that the crew had probably died at different times over hours or days as the anomaly took them, and it was better to leave it open. Director Mara Osei stood in front of that wall 2 weeks after the signing. She had come home for the first time in 4 years. The city was different than she remembered, or she was different, which was more likely. She stood in the park in the early morning, when no one else was around, and she read names. She did not read all 400,000, but she read many of them, moving slowly along the curve of the stone, touching nothing, just reading. She was still there when the sound came, a low, building hum from the direction of the sky to the north. The sound of engines. Many engines, enormous and controlled. The sound of something very large moving at a pace that was careful and deliberate. She looked up. The Thermopylae came first, descending through cloud cover into clear air, its hull enormous against the blue morning sky. The old United Earth banner painted across its nose alongside the newer flag of the Vanguard state. Behind it, in a long column, came other ships. Not all 214, but many. Enough. Their hulls were dark and marked with the quiet evidence of decades of work and life lived on them. Patches and welds and additions that were not beautiful in the way the Conclave's ships were beautiful, but that said something true about the people who had made them. Mara watched them come in. A few meters away, on a park bench, a woman was sitting with a small child on her lap. The woman was dark-skinned and wore her hair close to her head, and she was looking at the ships in the sky with an expression that Mara recognized. The expression of someone who had prepared their whole life for a thing and was now watching it happen and was not entirely sure how to contain it. The woman was Vanguard-born. She was here for the first time, sitting on actual ground, under an actual open sky, on the world her family had come from and never expected to return to. The child on her lap was small, maybe 3 or 4 years old, with round eyes fixed on the ships coming out of the clouds above them. The child pointed up. Her voice was clear and simple in the morning air. "Are those ours?" The woman looked down at her daughter. Something moved across her face, large and complicated and old. She reached down and pressed her free hand, open and flat, against the grass beside the bench. The ground under her palm. Solid. Real. The world her grandparents had left and her parents had been born without, and she had grown up hearing about the way you hear about something in a dream. She held her hand there for a long moment. Then she looked up at her daughter and said, quietly, "They always were." The Vanguard state took up its place in the galaxy in the weeks and months that followed. It was not a simple process. Nothing about what came next was simple. There were arguments and complications and setbacks and moments when it seemed like the work of building something new was harder than the work of fighting for the right to build it had been. That was how it always went, when the emergency was over and the real thing began. But the precursor forges were open now, open not just to the fleet, but, under careful and negotiated agreements, to research teams from species across the galaxy. The understanding that had taken the Vanguard decades of isolation to develop began to spread, piece by piece, into the hands of scientists and engineers who had never had access to it before. The things that could be built and learned and solved with those tools, in the hands of a galaxy working together rather than a council keeping secrets, that was a conversation that was only just beginning. The new oversight body held its first session 3 months after the signing. 11 species sent representatives. The Vanguard state sent Counselor Tam. The session was recorded in full and published within hours. It was, by most accounts, somewhat boring, procedural, careful, full of the kind of slow and specific language that governing bodies use when they are trying to be precise. Nothing dramatic happened. That was, everyone agreed, rather the point. Vasquez returned to the Thermopylae after the signing and did not return to Earth or the Conclave station. She had work to do. Her fleet needed maintenance, her people needed time, and the precursor forges needed attention. She was not a politician. She had done the politician's work because it needed to be done and she was the one who could do it, But the ship was where she belonged and the ship was where she went. She stood at the viewport on the night of the signing, looking out at the stars beyond the Kareth Veil. They looked the same as they always had from this angle, the same cold lights she had grown up watching, that her parents had grown up watching, that her grandfather had watched on the last night before the council cut the way home. She had brought them home. Not all of them. Too many names were gone, too many years. But the people who remained. The children and grandchildren of the ones who had been lost. She had brought them back, and she had done it without becoming a monster, and the galaxy knew the truth now, and the structure that had made the lie possible was being taken apart and rebuilt. It was not everything. It would never be everything. History did not work that way. It did not give you complete victories with clean edges. But it was something real. She stayed at the viewport for a long time. Then she turned away and went back to work. Behind her, the stars kept burning, cold and patient as they always had. But the dark between them was a little less complete than it had been 73 years ago, when a fleet had disappeared into it and the galaxy had looked away. The dark had tried to swallow them. They had come back from it carrying light.